They had touched a dead star. We burned right back. The first thing Sergeant Yara Vasek noticed about the object was that it had no shadow. Everything on Kepler's drift cast a shadow. The dust castles, the gnarled iron formations, the survey rigs with their skeletal arms reaching into a sky the color of a bruised eye. All of them threw their darkness behind them when the twin suns rose. But the thing that had come down 3 nights ago sat in the middle of Grid Sector 9 and swallowed the light around it like a wound in the world. No shadow, no reflection. Just a dull gunmetal silence about the size of a transit shuttle, half buried in the chalky sediment as if it had been there for 10,000 years, and was only now allowing itself to be noticed. Vasek circled it twice before she touched her comm. Control, I've got eyes on the anomaly. Preliminary read is negative on thermal signature. Negative on electromagnetic pulse residue. Whatever it is, it's cold. Copy, Vasek. Survey team is 20 minutes out. Hold position, she held position. She was good at that. 14 years in the Terrestrial Survey Corps had made her good at a great many things she hadn't particularly wanted to be good at. Patience chief among them. Before that had been 6 years with the 31st Expeditionary, 2 combat deployments, 1 medical discharge that hadn't quite stuck, and a reclassification to survey work that her commanding officer at the time had described, with painful diplomatic precision, as an alternative career trajectory suited to her temperament. What he'd meant was that she asked too many questions and broke too many things figuring out why they worked. She crouched in the dust and studied the object, and waited for the survey team, and thought about nothing in particular. The survey team arrived in 19 minutes, Doctor. Eli Marsh came first, climbing out of the crawler before it had fully stopped, his white isolation suit already smudged at the knees from some prior encounter with the ground. Behind him came 3 technicians and Dr. Soren Halvik, the expedition's xenomineralogist, who moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who had spent 30 years being right about things and intended to keep his record clean. You didn't touch it, Halvik said. It wasn't a question. I touched it, Vasek said. Halvik stopped walking. Sergeant, gloved hand, Doctor. I'm not an idiot. She held up her right hand. The survey glove was intact. No thermal transfer. No vibration. The surface texture reads as crystalline on haptic, but the spectrometer couldn't classify the compound. It returned a null string, not unknown, null. Like the software forgot there was a category for it. Halvik looked at the object for a long time. Something moved through his expression that Vasek had learned to read in scientists. Not excitement exactly, but the specific tension of a man who has spent his whole life waiting for one particular door, and is suddenly standing in front of it. Ellie, he said quietly, get the deep scanner. What the deep scanner found after 4 hours of analysis that Vasek spent mostly drinking cold coffee and watching the twin suns arc across the bruised sky was this. The object was not a rock. It was not a manufactured structure in any configuration registered in the colonial database. It was not a weapon, a probe, or a vessel. What it appeared to be, according to Halvik's increasingly agitated annotations, was a fragment, a piece of something far larger that had broken apart at altitude and scattered across the sector, with this piece being the largest recovered portion, and embedded in its crystalline matrix, at a density that made the scanner throw 3 separate error flags, was an element that did not exist on the periodic table. Halvik named it Valanthite. After his daughter, he would regret this later. The Vela came 3 weeks after the discovery went into the Colonial Broadcast Network. Vasek was on her 3rd rotation of perimeter watch, when the long-range sensor aboard the survey station pinged a contact at the edge of the system. She was at the console in 40 seconds, pulling the read manually, because the automated alert had already choked on the size of the return. The contact was not a ship. It was a configuration, 17 distinct mass signatures moving in a formation she had never seen before. Slow and deliberate, the way a hand reaches towards something it intends to pick up. The formation held a geometric precision that no natural phenomenon produced. Someone had arranged those 17 masses. Someone was moving them with purpose. She opened a channel to Halvik's quarters. He answered on the 4th ping, voice thick with sleep. We have company, she said. She heard him sit up. Colonial relay? No, something else. A pause. The sound of him breathing. How far out? At current velocity, 7 hours. Another pause longer. Wake everyone. She was already doing it. The Vela did not announce themselves. They did not broadcast on any frequency Vasek's equipment could detect. They simply arrived at orbital distance 6 hours and 43 minutes after first contact, arranged their 17 vessels in a configuration that the station's tactical computer described, unhelpfully, as non-threatening but unclassified, and then sent a single pulse of energy down to the surface. The pulse struck the object in grid sector 9. The object lit up. Vasek watched on the external feeds as the dull gunmetal surface began to emit a pale luminescence. Not bright, not blinding, but steady and deep, like something waking from a long sleep. The crystalline matrix pulsed in a rhythm that her biometrics sweet-flagged as eerily similar to a heartbeat. She watched the readouts climb and felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "It's a beacon," Marsh said from beside her. His voice was very calm. "They left it here. Deliberately. They've been waiting for someone to find it." "How long has it been here?" Vasek asked. Halvik's voice came from behind them both. He was standing in the doorway of the ops room, still in his sleep clothes, holding a tablet displaying the deep scan data. His face had the look of a man arriving late to an accident he now realized he had caused. "Based on the sediment stratification," he said, "approximately 40,000 years." The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms. The Vela made contact 14 minutes later, through a method no one had anticipated. They caused the object, the beacon, to emit a sequence of pulses that, when run through the station's translation matrix, resolved into something approaching language. Not human language, not any language in the xenolinguistics library, but structured, intentional, carrying meaning the way compressed air carries pressure. The xenolinguist on staff, young woman named Petra Solano, who had never in her professional life expected to use her doctorate for anything more demanding than colonial treaty negotiations, spent 9 hours working with the pulse sequences while Vasek stood watch, and the orbital formation held its position with the patience of geological time. What Solano eventually extracted was not a greeting, it was not a warning. It was something that, translated as precisely as the matrix allowed, came out as a claim. The element, Valanthite, the thing Halvik had named after his daughter, the thing in the beacon, the thing now showing up in trace quantities across 17 survey sites on Kepler's drift. The Vela considered it theirs, not found by them, not mined by them, not even, as far as Vasek could determine from the subsequent pulse sequences, used by them in any conventional sense, but theirs. A possession in the most fundamental sense. The way a species possesses a language or a history or a name for the thing that lives at the center of the universe. The Valanthite was a Vela material. It had originated, Solano's translation suggested, from their home system, carried to this sector by a catastrophic event so far in the past that the word the Vela used for the time frame was the same word they used for the concept of before. Before everything, before now, and they had come to take it back. They didn't even ask, Marsh said. He had gone very pale. They didn't say please. They didn't offer anything. They just stated it. "In fairness," Solano said, "we did broadcast the discovery coordinates to every inhabited system in the colonial network. That's not an invitation for confiscation. We may not be the ones who get to define the terms." Vasek had been listening to this exchange from the corner of the ops room, with her arms folded and her coffee going cold. She had been thinking about the 17 vessels in orbit. She had been thinking about the formation, the way it was arranged not to threaten but to surround, the way a hand encircles something before lifting it. She had been thinking about a particular conversation she'd had, 11 years ago, with a squad leader on her second deployment, who had been the wisest person she'd ever met in a firefight, or out of one. What he told her was this: the most dangerous moment in any confrontation is not when someone threatens you. It's when someone doesn't think they need to. "I need everyone in the ops room," Vasek said. "Now. All staff. I don't care what they're doing." She had 11 people. 1 sergeant with a combat background and a Survey Corps classification. 3 survey technicians. 2 geologists, one of whom was Halvik. 1 xenolinguist who was still pale from her 9 hours with the pulse sequences. 1 station doctor, 1 logistics coordinator, 1 young man named Devlin, who operated the communications array, and had never, to Vasek's knowledge, been in a situation more dangerous than a software crash, and Eli Marsh, who had touched the beacon before anyone told him not to. She laid it out plainly. She did not soften it. 11 people did not need softening, they needed the truth. The Vela wanted the Valanthite. The Valanthi was distributed across 17 survey sites on the surface of Kepler's drift. The Colonial Rescue Service was a minimum of 19 days out. The station had no weapons. The Vela had 17 vessels of unknown capability, and the demonstrated ability to activate alien artifacts from orbit. "Here's what we know about the material," Vasek said. "Halvik, your summary." "Short version." Halvik cleared his throat. He had changed out of his sleep clothes. This seemed to have given him some of his composure back. Valanthite emits radiation in a spectrum we don't have a name for, not ionizing in any conventional sense, but the scanner data suggests it interacts with biological tissue in ways we haven't fully characterized. Direct exposure to the concentrated form, the beacon for instance, produces cellular-level effects that appear to be cumulative. The diffuse surface deposits are likely below threshold for acute harm. The beacon is not. And Marsh's exposure, Vasek said. Marsh looked up from the end of the table. He had wrapped his right hand, the one he'd used to touch the beacon, gloved, in a secondary scanner cuff that was monitoring his cellular readouts. The readouts were not alarming, but they were not nothing. Trace levels, Marsh said. Petra and I have theorized that the energy pulse the Vela sent down, the one that woke the beacon, may have briefly elevated the emission profile before it stabilized. I was scanning the object at the time. He paused. I feel fine. He does feel fine, the station doctor confirmed, in a tone that was not entirely reassuring. Vasek nodded. Okay, here's what I'm thinking. What she was thinking was not subtle. It was not clever. It was the kind of thinking she'd been trained for in the 31st Expeditionary. Stripped of everything except function. Identify what you have. Identify what they want. Find the point where those two things become leverage. What she had was the Valanthite. Or rather, what she had was access to the Valanthite. Every surface deposit, every scanner record, every survey map showing the distribution across the grid. 11 people and a station full of equipment and 17 sites that the Vela, for all their patience, could not simply scoop up from orbit without knowing exactly where to look. The beacon had given them a general location. The survey data gave the precise distribution. Solano, Vasek said. Can you send a pulse sequence back? Use the beacon as a relay? Solano blinked. Yes, theoretically. The activation pulse established a bidirectional channel. I'd be broadcasting in their language, or trying to. The translation accuracy in the other direction is going to be rough. Rough is fine. I need them to understand one thing. Vasek leaned forward. We need to buy 19 days. We don't need to win. We just need to still be here when the rescue service arrives. She sent the first message 6 hours after the Vela's claim. Solano structured it in the Vela pulse language as carefully as she could. A counterstatement, not a refusal. An acknowledgement of the claim followed by a request for. The translation was improprocess, a process, a formalized sequence of exchange. Something the Vela pulse language apparently had a word for that came through in the matrix as something between negotiation and ceremony. The Vela responded in 4 minutes. The response was long. Solano spent 2 hours on it. What she extracted in the end was this. The Vela were willing to engage in the process, but they required a demonstration of good faith. Specifically, and this was where Solano's translation became halting, and she used her hands to fill in the gaps. They required proof that the humans understood what they had found. Not scientifically. Understood it in some deeper sense that Solano's matrix kept rendering as either respected or recognized or witnessed. They want us to prove we know what it is, Marsh said. Or what it means, Solano said. Those might be the same thing to them. Vasek looked at Halvik, the deep scan data. The origin event, the catastrophic thing that put the material here 40,000 years ago. Do we have any reconstruction of what that was? Halvik was already at his tablet. He had been at it since the conversation started, the way a man picks up a tool he forgot he was holding. The isotopic ratios in the beacon matrix suggest an event of substantial scale. The kind of event that doesn't happen to rocks. The kind that happens to worlds. He looked up. I think the Vela had a planet. And it's gone. The room was quiet for a moment. And the Valanthite is what's left, Marsh said. Some of it. Scattered across however many systems over 40,000 years. Halvik set the tablet down. His voice had changed. The defensiveness was gone, and what was underneath was something older and quieter. We named the material after my daughter. I thought it was. It seemed like the right gesture. A human gesture. He paused. I may not have understood what I was naming. Vasek looked at him for a long moment. Can you put together a presentation? Everything the scanner found about the origin event, the timeline, the distribution, the beacon's emission data, everything we know about what happened to them. For the Vela? For the negotiation. I'm a geologist, Sergeant. I study rocks. Right now, you're the only person on this station who understands what these particular rocks mean. Start there. Halvik worked for 31 hours without sleeping. Vasek knew because she didn't sleep either. She maintained watch rotations, kept everyone on task, monitored the orbital formation, and drank more cold coffee than was medically advisable. The Vela vessels didn't move. They held their formation with a stillness that was, she had decided, not patience in the human sense, but something more like geological time. The stillness of a thing that has been waiting so long that waiting is no longer an experience, just a state. On the second day, Marsh's scanner cuff flagged an anomaly. It was minor. A cellular irregularity in the tissue of his right hand, the hand that had touched the beacon surface, even through the glove. During the moment, the activation pulse was running through it. The doctor examined it for 2 hours and came back with an expression that was carefully composed. "It's not harmful," the doctor said. "Not yet. But it's... the cells are doing something I don't have a classification for. They're responding to the Volanthite trace exposure in a way that doesn't match any known radiation interaction model. The affected tissue is producing a faint electromagnetic signature." She paused. Ely's hand glows in the dark. Marsh held up his right hand and looked at it. In the dim light of the medical bay, the faint luminescence was barely visible. A pale, steady glow, deep in the tissue, like a coal that has given up burning but hasn't quite given up its heat. "Does it hurt?" Vasek asked. "No," Marsh said. He looked at his hand for another moment. Then, with the deliberateness of a man putting something back in a drawer, he lowered it. "What do we do with it?" Vasek thought about that. "Nothing yet. Keep the cuff on. Tell me if it changes." She paused. "And don't touch the beacon again." "I wasn't planning to, I know. I'm telling you anyway." Halvik's presentation was extraordinary. Vasek had expected something adequate, a scientist, working under time pressure, with a xenolinguist translating for an audience that experienced reality in a fundamentally different way. She had expected adequate and planned to work with it. What she got was something that made her stop and look at him differently. He had taken the scanner data and the isotopic analysis in the beacon's emission records and built a reconstruction of an event that had happened 40,000 years ago. A world in a system roughly corresponding to what humans now call the Vela constellation. A world with an ocean and an atmosphere and, the reconstruction suggested, life, complex, organized life. And then an event, not a collision, not a supernova, something internal, deep in the planet's core, a cascade failure of whatever geological or physical process had generated the Volanthite in the first place. An uncontrolled reaction that had, in geological terms, been nearly instantaneous. The world had come apart, not destroyed in an explosion. Come apart, fragmented, dispersed. The material of it scattered across the local stellar neighborhood over thousands of years of orbital mechanics, drifting outward and outward, landing on moons and asteroids and survey planets on the edge of the colonial reach. "The Vela didn't just lose a planet," Marsh said quietly, looking at the reconstruction. "They lost everything. Whatever civilization was there, whatever they'd built. And they survived," Vasek said. "The ones that were off-world when it happened, or evolved separately on another body." She looked at the display, 40,000 years, and they're still looking for the pieces. "Grief at a geological scale," Solano said. She looked hollowed out. "I don't have a framework for that." Vasek looked at the reconstruction for a long time. She thought about what it meant to lose a world. She thought about what it meant to cross the distance between stars, to gather what remained of something that had once been everything you were. She thought about what the Vela had said, or what the Matrix had rendered as said, about the Volanthite. Not property, not resource. Remains. "Okay," she said, "we send them the reconstruction. We send them everything Halvik built, no conditions, no negotiation opening. Just the data." She looked around the room. "They need to know we understand what we found." Halvik looked at her. Something moved through his expression. And then we asked them to talk to us." The Vela response to the reconstruction came in a form Solano had never seen before. Not pulses, not a structured sequence, but a sustained emission from the beacon that lasted 11 minutes and registered across every sensor on the station. Not threatening, not damaging, just present in the way a sound is present when it fills a room and changes the quality of the air. When it was over, Solano was crying. She was not entirely sure why. The emission hadn't carried language, not in any form she could parse. But it had carried something. She described it, in her log entry that night, as receiving a frequency that the body knew even if the mind didn't. The Vela sent a follow-up pulse sequence 4 hours later. Solano worked it for 6 hours. What she extracted, rendered as faithfully as the Matrix allowed, was something she read aloud to the assembled team in a voice that was trying to be professional. "We did not expect you to know this. We have found this material in 31 other inhabited systems. No one knew this. They've been doing this for a long time," Marsh said. going from system to system, retrieving what they can. And we're the first ones who understood what they were retrieving, Halvik said. He sounded like a man hearing something about himself that he didn't know whether to be proud of. That changes the negotiation, Vasek said. Does it change anything for Marsh? The doctor asked. Vasek looked at Marsh. His hand was in his lap, the scanner cuff blinking steadily. In the low light of the ops room, the luminescence was faintly visible through the cuff's material. A ghostly pale light, patient and deep. It might, Vasek said. She asked Solano to craft the next message carefully, not a demand. Not a request for rescue service time. Just a statement of fact, offered openly, in the way you might open your hands to show they're empty. One of our people was exposed to the material when your signal reached it. He is not harmed, but he carries a trace of it now. We don't know what that means. We thought you should know. The Vela's response came in 40 minutes. Solano translated it in stages, her face shifting as she worked. They want, she said slowly, to send someone down. The room went very still. One of them, Solano continued. Two, the translation is really uncertain here, but the closest I can get is to look at him. To examine. The word they use isn't medical. It's closer to witness. To witness what? The doctor asked. Solano set the tablet down. I think they want to see what happened when the material touched a human being. She looked at Marsh. I think to them, what happened to Eli is significant. In a way I don't completely understand. Vasek looked at Marsh. He was looking at his hand. Eli, she said. I heard, he said, your call. He was quiet for a moment. The room was quiet with him. Outside the station, the dust of Kepler's drift moved in the slow currents of a world that one hadn't known it was sitting on 40,000 years of someone else's grief. Somewhere in orbit, 17 vessels held their formation and waited. Tell them yes, Marsh said. The Vela delegate arrived in what Vasek could only describe as a controlled falling, a single entity, unenclosed, descending from the orbital position without any vehicle she could identify. It hit the surface 300 meters from the station and walked the rest of the distance. They watched it on the external feeds. Vasek kept her hands very still. The Vela was large, 3 meters, roughly bipedal, but with a geometry that suggested bilateral symmetry, had been a historical accident rather than a design commitment. Its surface was dark and non-reflective, and it moved with the slow deliberateness of something that didn't experience urgency as a concept. It stopped outside the station's outer lock and waited. Vasek went to the lock herself. Marsh stood beside her. You don't have to be here, she said. I know, he said. She opened the lock. The Velia delegate stood in the frame of the outer door and looked at them. Its sensory apparatus. Vasek defaulted to that term because face implied things she wasn't ready to imply, oriented toward Marsh. It made no sound. It made no gesture that her threat assessment training flagged as aggressive. It simply looked, with whatever it looked with, at the faint luminescence in Eli Marsh's right hand. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the Vela raised one of its limbs, slowly, deliberately, in the way you move when you want to make sure the motion is understood as voluntary, and placed the end of it against the outer wall of the station. Where it touched, the metal didn't burn or corrode. Instead, a faint luminescence appeared in the surface, pale deep, the same quality as the light in Marsh's hand. Like recognizes, like Vasek thought. She didn't know where the thought came from. She filed it. The delegate withdrew its limb and stepped back. Then, in the pulse language that Solano had spent 9 days learning, it emitted a sequence that Vasek's comm unit translated with approximately 76% confidence. You have carried it. This changes what you are to us. The negotiation that followed was the strangest 9 days of Vasek's life, and she had been in situations that would make most people's lists. The Vela delegate, which Solano eventually designated, for operational clarity, as speaker, since the Vela term for its own function didn't resolve to anything English had a drawer for, conducted the exchange through pulse sequences that Solano translated in real time with improving accuracy as the days passed and the matrix adapted. The exchanges moved slowly because moving slowly was what the Vela did, at every scale. What Vasek learned, pieced together across 17 sessions with speaker standing at the outer lock while the team sat at the ops table with Solano, in the middle translating like a woman holding 2 live wires apart. The Vela were not a government. They were not a species in the sense humans use the word, a single biological category under a unified social structure. They were a remnant, what had survived the loss of their world 40,000 years ago, scattered across however many star systems, maintaining coherence across interstellar distances, through a mechanism that Solano's matrix consistently rendered as memory of the same word. which she eventually decided to just call the word the Valanthe carried, the word embedded in the beacon. They were, in the most literal sense Vasek could construct, a people who had nothing left but the right word for what they had lost. And they had come to Kepler's drift because someone had broadcast that they'd found pieces of that word. And for the first time in 31 encounters across 100 centuries, someone had listened to what those pieces said. They're not going to take it by force, Vasek said on the 6th day. They could. 17 vessels and we have nothing. But they're not going to. Why not? The doctor asked. Vasek thought about the moment at the outer lock. The delegate's limb against the metal, the matched luminescence. The phrase her comm unit had rendered as you have carried it. Because we understood. And to them, that matters more than possession. That seems like a very convenient thing to believe, Halvik said. It does, Vasek agreed. I'm believing it anyway. On the 7th day, she made an offer. She didn't run it past anyone first. She sat in the ops room at 0300 station time, when the rest of the team was sleeping, and she drafted the pulse sequence in the notation Solano had been teaching her, and she thought about it for a long time, and then she sent it. The offer was this: the surface deposits of valanthite across the 17 survey sites, the diffuse, scattered material the humans would not extract, would not survey further, would not broadcast coordinates for, would mark as restricted in the colonial database on grounds of xenocultural significance, which was a real category, invoked rarely, that carried legal weight in colonial law. In exchange, the humans kept the scanner data, the reconstruction, the knowledge of what had happened, the right to carry that knowledge and share it with the 41 inhabited systems they knew about and any others they encountered. So that when the Vela came to those systems, someone would understand what they were looking for. The Vela responded at 0700. Solano was awake by then, because Vasek had woken her to do the translation. She read it 3 times before she spoke. They accept, she said. Her voice was careful. But there's a condition. Of course there is, Vasek said. The condition is the one who carries the trace, Marsh. They want to know if he will carry it knowingly, going forward. The word they use is, Solano checked her notes, the same word as remember, but active, like an ongoing act. They want to know if he'll remember deliberately. Vasek looked at Marsh. He had been at the table since she'd woken him, his glowing hand resting on the surface, the scanner cuff reading steady. Tell them, Marsh said, that I'll carry it. But tell them in a way that lets them understand I don't know exactly what I'm agreeing to. Is that wise? Halvik asked. Probably not, but it's honest. Solano composed the response. It took her 40 minutes to find the pulse notation for something that was both a commitment and an admission of partial ignorance. When she sent it, Vasek thought it might be the most human sentence that had ever been transmitted in an alien language. The Vela fleet began withdrawing from the orbital position on the 9th day. Not all at once. The 17 vessels peeled away over the course of 6 hours, each one departing in a direction that suggested they were not leaving the system but redistributing, the way a hand opens one finger at a time when it decides something isn't what it needed to be grabbed. Speaker remained longest. It stood at the outer lock for 2 hours after the last vessel had moved out of direct sensor range, emitting nothing, doing nothing, simply standing there in the way a geological formation stands. Not waiting, not watching, just being present in the way that things are present when they have decided to be. Then it emitted one final sequence. Solano translated it in real time, her voice very steady. In 31 other systems, she said, they came. And the people there were afraid and took what they could before leaving. In some systems, they were hostile. She paused. In one system, they were destroyed. Another pause. The Vela have not been destroyed in any encounter, but they have been, the word is complicated, diminished, not in a military sense. Something more like each encounter where they were not understood cost them something they couldn't replace. Solano lowered the tablet. In this system, they were not diminished. The lock was silent. Speaker did not move. Is that all? Vasek asked. Solano checked the notation again. There's one more word. It comes separately at the end. It doesn't translate cleanly. She was quiet for a moment. The closest I can get is the word we use when we tell each other what we are called. A name. They're giving us a name. She looked at Vasek, in their language, for what humans are. What does it mean? Marsh asked. Solano thought about it for a long time. Outside, Speaker turned and began its controlled ascent back toward the orbital position, dark and unhurried, moving the way something moves when it knows where it's going. The ones who look at the ruins and tell you what was there, she said finally. The rescue service arrived 19 days after first contact. Vasek wrote her after-action report in a single Sixel session, which her commanding officer read 3 times before calling her on a secured channel. "This is the strangest document I have read in 30 years of command," he said. "Yes, sir. You gave up 17 sites of xenomaterial with significant commercial and scientific value." "Yes, sir. Based on a moral assessment of the situation. Based on the available intelligence, sir." The moral assessment was a component, a long pause. "Halvik is citing you in his xenomineralogy paper. He's naming the origin event theory after the expedition. He should name it after himself. He did the reconstruction. He says you told him to build it. That without the reconstruction, there would have been no negotiation. Someone would have figured it out." "Sergeant." His voice changed slightly, not softer but different in texture, the way a senior officer's voice changes when they are setting the official record aside for a moment. "What was it like, the delegate, being in the same room?" Vasek thought about the outer lock, the slow deliberateness of a thing that had been patient for 40,000 years, the limb against the metal, the matched light. "It was like being looked at by something that had stopped being surprised by anything," she said. "And then being surprised anyway." Another pause. "And Marsh? He's fine. The cellular effect appears stable. The doctor says it may be permanent." She looked across the ops room to where Marsh was standing at the window, his right hand raised slightly, watching the faint glow move through his own skin. "He says it doesn't hurt. He says sometimes he wakes up at night and looks at it, and tries to think about 40,000 years." A pause. "He says he can't, but he keeps trying." A long quiet on the channel, then write it up, all of it. The translation logs, the reconstruction, the exchange record. Everything. For the Colonial Archive, for every archive, in every system we can reach. A pause. "If the Vila come to those systems, someone should know what to say to them." Vasek looked at her own hands. Unglowing, unremarkable. Human hands. Calloused at the trigger guard and the survey grip. The hands of someone who had spent 14 years touching the surfaces of things and asking what they were made of. "Copy that," she said. "I'll get it done." She started writing. Outside the window of the survey station, Kepler's drift turned slowly under its twin suns. In grid sector 9, the beacon sat cold and quiet, no longer emitting, no longer lit. But the shadow it had never cast was there in the data. Vasek had checked on the first morning after the Vala left. The deep scanner, run across the beacon surface in full daylight, showed something the spectrometer categorized not as null but as present. A faint electromagnetic signature, the same quality as the light in Marsh's hand. The Valanthite remembered. She supposed, in the end, that was all any of them were doing. Carrying what they could. Going toward it honestly. Saying, "I don't know exactly what I'm agreeing to, but I'll agree." Staying in the room when the door opened. That was the thing about humans. The thing that apparently, in 31 systems over 40,000 years, no one had quite managed to account for. You could wait a geological age and still be surprised by it. They had found something ancient, and broken, and grieving, and instead of taking it, or running from it, or building walls against it, 11 people on a survey station at the edge of the colonial reach had done the one thing that humans, in Vasek's experience, could never quite stop themselves from doing, even when it would have been easier not to. They'd tried to understand it, and that, it turned out, was enough to change what they were. Halvik stopped her in the corridor on the morning of the 14th day, after the rescue service had arrived and the debrief cycle had begun. And the station was full of unfamiliar faces conducting serious assessments of everything Vasek's team had done. He looked different. She had noticed it since the Vela left, but hadn't found the right moment to say anything about it. His posture had changed. Not more confident exactly, but less defended. The way a man's posture changes when he stops bracing for something he's been bracing against for years. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't." "I named that element after my daughter," he said. "I thought it was a generous act, a scientific honor." He paused. "I was treating the whole thing as if it was mine to name." Vasek waited. The reconstruction changed that. While I was building it, going through the isotopic data, working out the timeline of the origin event, at some point, I stopped being a geologist analyzing a sample. He stopped. Searched for words. I started being someone trying to understand what it meant to lose something that fundamental. A world, the ground everything stands on. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if I succeeded. But I started trying." "That's usually enough," Vasek said. "Is it? We gave up 17 sites of commercially recoverable material based on me trying. We gave up 17 sites based on me deciding that your trying was sufficient evidence of the right call. She met his eyes. That's on me, you just did the geology. Halvik almost smiled. It was the expression of a man who had spent a long career being right about rocks and was now discovering that being right about people was a completely different muscle, and he had apparently been using it without noticing. My daughter is 12, he said. When I told her I'd named a newly discovered element after her, she said that was embarrassing and asked if she could change it. He paused. I'm going to tell her what it actually is, what it actually means. Another pause. I think she deserves to know what her name is attached to. Vasek thought about that. What will you tell her? Halvik thought about it for a long moment. That somewhere, a very long way away, something went wrong that shouldn't have gone wrong, and that the remnants of it ended up here, and we found them. And we tried to understand what had happened before we decided what to do. He paused. That sometimes trying to understand something is itself a form of respect, even if you don't fully manage it. She's 12, Vasek said. Will she get that? She's 12 and she reads at a university level, and she corrects my papers when I leave them on the kitchen table. He paused. She'll probably understand it better than I do. Vasek nodded. She started to move past him down the corridor, then stopped. Halvik. He turned. The paper you're writing. Make sure the reconstruction is in it, every detail. The origin event, the timeline, the distribution model, all of it. She paused. The Colonial Archive isn't enough. Peer-review journals, xenoanthropology databases, the Open Science Network, everywhere it can go. I'm already planning to. Good. Because the Vela are going to go to more systems. And when they do, whoever finds that material needs to have already read what you wrote. She paused again. The 32nd system should do better than the 31st, and the 33rd better than the 32nd. Halvik looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he said, you think about things on a long time scale. I try to, she said. It's harder than it sounds. Marsh's condition was formally assessed by the rescue service medical team on day 16. 3 doctors, 2 xenobiologists, and a physicist who specialized in non-standard radiation interactions spent 4 hours examining his right hand, running every scan available to the team's equipment, and comparing the results against Halvik's data on Valenthite emission profiles. Their conclusion, delivered to Vasek and Marsh together in the medical bay, while Marsh sat on the examination table with his glowing hand resting on his knee, was this. The cellular effect was permanent, stable, and non-progressive. It would not spread. It would not worsen. The cells in his right hand had undergone a structural modification at the molecular level that was unlike any known radiation-induced cellular change, in that it was not damage. The cells were not mutated or degraded. They had been, the lead physician used the word altered, then crossed it out verbally and said modified, then paused and said reconfigured, and then sighed and said she didn't have a precise term for it because the configuration the cells had settled into was not a known biological state. What does the hand do? Marsh asked. Practically, the physicist answered. In terms of function, nothing unusual. No measurable increase in strength or sensitivity. No electromagnetic emission above the visible glow. No radiation output detectable at arm's length. He paused. The glow itself is produced by a photon emission process we haven't fully characterized, but it appears to be metabolically driven. It fluctuates slightly with Marsh's heart rate. Marsh looked at his hand. It breathes, he said. In a sense, the physicist said. He sounded slightly awed and slightly unnerved, which Vasek thought was exactly the right combination. There's one more thing, the lead physician said. She was looking at her tablet with an expression that combined scientific caution with something that took Vasek a moment to identify as reverence. The photon emission profile. The spectrum of the light. She turned the tablet so they could see the spectral analysis. It's identical to the beacon emission signature. The pulse the Vela sent down on the first day. The room was quiet. He's emitting the same signal the beacon emits, Vasek said. Faintly. At 1/10,000th the power. But structurally identical, yes. Marsh looked at his hand for a long time. So if the Vela encounter someone who's been in contact with me, with my hand, we don't know what they'd perceive, the physician said. But theoretically, they would register the same emission signature they associate with Valenthite, with the material they're searching for. He's a beacon, Solano said from the doorway. She had been listening. She looked at Marsh, with an expression that was trying to be analytical, and wasn't quite making it. Ellie, you're a beacon. Marsh looked at his hand. Then he said slowly, Speaker said I'd carry it. Going forward, he paused. I thought that was metaphorical. The Vela, Vasek said carefully, may not have a strong distinction between metaphor and fact. On the 17th day, Vasek received a personal message through the colonial network. It had originated from a relay point 3 systems away and had been in transit for 11 days, which meant it had been sent 4 days after first contact, before anyone outside the Kepler's drift system had known anything was happening. The message was from her old squad leader, the one from her second deployment, the wisest person she'd ever known in a firefight or out of one. He had heard of the Kepler's drift contact through the colonial broadcast and had followed it through the update cycle. He hadn't reached out sooner because, he wrote, he'd wanted to see how it resolved before saying anything. The message was short. It said, "You held the position, that's the job. Everything after that is the story people tell about how you held it. Make sure someone tells it right." He had retired 8 years ago. She hadn't spoken to him in 3. She sat in the empty ops room and read the message twice and thought about what it meant to have someone who knew what you'd been trained for and recognized when you'd used it correctly, even when what you'd used it for looked nothing like what you'd been trained for. She thought about the outer lock. 11 people, no weapons, 17 vessels in orbit. The moment when the lock opened, she wrote back. It took her a while. When she finished, it said, "There were 11 of us. None of them were trained for it. I think that's why it worked. When you're trained for something, you sometimes stop seeing the other options." These people hadn't been trained not to listen. They just listened. She sent it and went back to the debrief cycle. The formal colonial assessment, completed 22 days after first contact, classified the Kepler's drift encounter as a Category 7 xenocultural event, the first such classification in 30 years of colonial expansion, and designated the 17 survey sites as protected xenocultural zones under Statute 7.4.2 of the Colonial Resource Covenant. It noted, in language that was careful and diplomatic and drained of everything specific that had made the encounter what it was, that the survey teams handling a first contact had demonstrated best practice adherence to xenodiplomatic protocols and recommended commendation for all team members. The commendation came through in the standard processing window of 90 days. By that time, Vasek was on a different assignment. Halvik's paper had been submitted to 4 journals and accepted by 3. Solano had been offered a chair in xenolinguistics at the Colonial University and had accepted it, and Marsh had taken a leave of absence from the Survey Corps. He had gone home, back to Earth, which neither of them had been to in years. He had written to Vasek once, a week after the formal assessment was completed, a short message that said, "I keep waking up and looking at the hand. My sister asked about it last night at dinner. I told her it was a work injury. She didn't believe me. I think I'll tell her the real story sometime. Not yet. I'm still working out how." Vasek had written back, "Tell her it's a reminder. That's what it is. Some reminders are inside your head, and some of them glow." She didn't know if that was helpful. She sent it anyway. The story did get told. Halvik's paper was the first formal telling, and it was read widely, not just in geology and xenomineralogy, but across the xenoanthropology community, the Colonial Diplomatic Corps, and, through an open-access translation released 8 months after publication, by a great many ordinary people, in a great many systems who had never thought about what a world's remains might look like scattered across the stellar neighborhood, or what it might mean to find someone who understood that before deciding what to do about it. The pulse language notation that Solano had developed during the 9-day negotiation was published as an appendix to her own follow-up paper and formed the basis of what became, over the following decade, the standard first contact protocol for Vela encounters. A protocol that was used 11 times in 7 different systems over the next 40 years. And that worked every time, because Halvik had done the reconstruction and Solano had done the translation. And Vasek had decided that trying to understand was sufficient evidence of the right call. In 3 of those 11 subsequent encounters, the human team on the ground included a xenolinguist who had read Solano's notation guide, a geologist who had read Halvik's paper, and someone who had kept a printed copy of a short message that said, "When the door opens, stay in the room." The Vela, for their part, continued their slow retrieval across the systems. They did not speak of the Kepler's drift encounter in any way that human linguists could decode, but in the pulse sequences they transmitted when they arrived in new systems. The opening statement of their presence and purpose. There was a phrase that the notation guide had not originally contained. added in the second edition after Solano worked it out from a recording sent by one of the subsequent teams. It came at the end of the opening statement. It was the word they had given the humans at Kepler's drift, the ones who look at the ruins and tell you what was there. But in subsequent encounters, it appeared not as a definition but as a question. Rendered into English as precisely as the Matrix allowed, it came out as something like, "Are you like them?" It was, every xenolinguist who worked with it agreed, the closest the Vela came to asking, "Are you the kind of people we can talk to?" 11 teams over 40 years answered yes. Every single one of them had read the paper. Every single one of them had done the reconstruction before they opened the lock. Every single one of them had someone who woke up in the night and tried to think about 40,000 years, and couldn't quite manage it, but kept trying anyway. That was the thing, the trying. The specific human inability to look at something vast and broken and ancient, and simply take what was useful and leave. The need irrational, persistent, frequently inconvenient, to ask what it meant, to sit with it, to say, "I don't completely understand what I'm agreeing to, but I'm going to agree honestly." The Vela had encountered 31 species before the humans. In none of those encounters had they given a name. In every encounter after Kepler's drift, they asked first if the people they were meeting were the ones who look at the ruins and tell you what was there. And when the answer was yes, when the team on the ground had read the paper and done the reconstruction and opened the lock, the Vela would emit a single pulse at the end of their opening statement. A short pulse, uncomplicated. Solano had classified it early on, in the first encounter, and her classification had been reproduced in every subsequent report. Not language, not a claim, not a question. Just a word, the one they used for recognition.